Around 7 p.m. on 15th February 1906, the High Commissioner for Northern Nigeria, Frederick Lugard, received an urgent telegram at his base in Zungeru stating,
"Whole of C Company, Mounted Infantry defeated and annihilated at Satiru. Sergeant Slack, RA, and myself, and Doctor only men remaining. Most urgent."
The concerned Lugard replied to ask who was behind the attack, whose side the Sarki Muslimi was on, and kept the telegraph line open all night. For several days, Lugard did not know who was responsible for the attack on the West African Frontier Force WAF unit. Oral tradition claimed that on his deathbed, Usman Dan Fodio predicted that the Sokoto Caliphate would last for a century, after which it would be succeeded by a foreign power for 4 years, followed by the arrival of the Mahdi, Messiah. Prophecies and millenarian beliefs had foretold that a Mahdi would rise to lead the people in struggle that would precede the end of the world. The general instability of the times, with catalytic societal changes such as war, violence, and displacement of the caliphate by foreigners, lent credence to the Mahdi prophecies. In the early 1900s, it seemed the prophecy had been partly fulfilled. Britain completed its conquest of the Sokoto Caliphate in 1903, almost exactly 100 years after the jihad it established it had commenced. By 1906, Britain had been in power for 3 years. For the prophecy to be completed, the Mahdi had to arrive soon. In 1904, the chief of the village of Satiru, about 14 miles south of Sokoto, declared himself to be the Mahdi and named his son Isa. The Sarki Muslimi summoned the self-proclaimed Mahdi to Sokoto, but he died while awaiting trial. The Mahdi's surviving followers were released after they swore an oath on the Quran not to repeat their heresy. 2 years later, another Mahdi emerged in French-controlled Niger, north of British territory. In December 1905 and January 1906, followers of this Mahdi repelled and killed French officers who tried to collect tax in their districts. Their leader, a near-blind cleric named Dan Makafo, fled south into the British-controlled territory of northern Nigeria, collecting thousands of followers as he traveled. He finally halted at Satiru and joined forces with Isa, the son of the previous self-professed Mahdi of Satiru. Satiru's habit of attracting dissident clerics led Lugard to remark that it was well known as a hotbed of fanatism. Despite his dismissal of the self-righteousness of the Mahdists, the irony is that both the British and the Mahdists presented themselves in the messianic way. A curious aspect of the Satiru Mahdists is how much their movement resembled modern-day outbursts of religious dissidents in northern Nigeria. The Satiru Mahdists attacked a neighboring village called Somo, which refused to join them. Subsequent dissident Muslim groups in the north, such as those surrounding Islamic leader Maitesani, also had millenarian beliefs, retreated into rural areas, attacked communities that refused to join them, and had confrontations with state security forces. In February 1906, when the resident at Sokoto, Major John Alder Burden, traveled out of Sokoto, a 31-year-old barrister named Hilary Richard Preston Hilary deputized for him during his absence. When Preston Hilary heard about events in Satiru, he set off for the village on 14th February 1906 along with British Army officers, mounted cavalry, 69 native WAF soldiers, and the assistant resident, Mr. Scott, who was to act as an interpreter. British accounts claim that Preston Hilary only wanted to talk to the Mahdists and did not want to fight them. However, to Preston Hilary's and his colleagues' surprise, the Mahdists found it difficult to believe that a column of armed foreigners and soldiers marching in formation towards them with guns and artillery had come in peace. When they arrived at Satiru, Preston Hilary and Scott rode forward on their horses. The army commander, Lieutenant Francis Blackwood, had ordered the soldiers to deploy in square formation, but he became concerned that Preston Hilary and Scott had ridden too far ahead of the soldiers accompanying them. It appears that the Mahdists had seen them coming from afar and started sprinting across 800 yards of field that separated them. Blackwood could not order his men to open fire without endangering Preston Hilary and Scott, who were in the line of fire between the soldiers and the advancing Mahdists. He instead ordered the soldiers to move forward towards the civilians to protect them. As the soldiers moved out from their square and advanced, the Mahdis descended on them before they could reform. The horses became alarmed and ran loose. In the ensuing melee of stampeding horses and soldiers out of formation, the Mahdis pounced on them with spears and agricultural tools such as axes and hoes, killed President Hillary, Blackwood, 24 native soldiers, and one of the WAF's horse attendants. They also captured one of the WAF's Maxim guns. With their commander dead and the chain of command disrupted, the soldiers were in disarray and started to retreat. As they did so, some of them demonstrated extraordinary courage. A native soldier, Private Moma Wurukin, saved the medical officer Dr. Martin Ellis, who was lying on the ground after being badly wounded by a spear injury to his right shoulder, by shooting the man who had wounded Ellis, catching one of the runaway horses, and lifting Ellis onto the horse. He did the same for Scott as well, all while shooting and holding the Mahdis at bay. However, one of the Mahdis knocked Scott off his horse, and the others surrounded and killed him when he fell to the ground. Another native soldier, Private Moma Zaria, saved the British officer who had fallen off his horse by running towards the Mahdis to pick him up and rescue him. The Mahdis chased the surviving soldiers for an hour. When the survivors returned to their base at Sokoto in disjointed groups of 2s and 3s, they remained vulnerable and fearful of a Mahdist attack. Moreover, the base was severely undermanned because Lugard had dispatched most of the fighting forces several hundred miles away on a reprisal mission to attack the Munshis, the thieves, as punishment for attacking the Royal Niger Company's depot at Abinti. To defend the base, the survivors preemptively issued weapons to anyone who could handle them, even civilian staff. The British officers stayed up all night on watch in case of a Mahdist attack. They also brought the native soldiers' wives to the base in order to discourage soldiers from deserting and replenish their stocks of food and water in case they had to withstand a siege. Had the native soldiers deserted, the British would have been at the mercy of the Mahdists. In view of the emergency and the absence of senior officers, the resident, Major Burden, abruptly returned from his journey and took temporary command of the base. Although he was now a political officer, Burden had a military background. He was the last commander of the Royal Niger Constabulary before the Royal Niger Company's charter was revoked. He had fought in earlier military campaigns in northern Nigeria, including the Constabulary's invasion of Bida and Ilorin. On 16th February, the increasingly worried Lugard sent a telegram to the Secretary of State for the colonies, Lord Elgin, expressing his concern that situation of affairs gives me sufficient cause for anxiety. On 24th February, Lugard sent another, more urgent telegram warning that
attitude of such of people, Hadija, had been consistently threatening, greatly adding to anxiety in present difficulty. Consider it necessary to put a stop to these threats by arresting ringleaders. I am uncertain which side Emir likely to take.
Lugard also requested reinforcements from the governor of southern Nigeria. Why was the usually unflappable Lugard sounding so shaky? For a start, the area was in a state of unrest and was awash with the sensational rumors that the Sarkin Muslimi and emirs supported the Mahdists, who had allegedly massacred the entire British expedition and left not a single man alive. In Bauchi, a Malam had been preaching in favor of exterminating infidels, while another was caught trying to incite the soldiers and was hanged. Another Mahdi had reportedly arisen in the northern town of Brumi, and the town of Hadija, halfway between Kano and Borno, was refusing cooperation with the colonial government. Hadija was so hostile to the British that they could not visit it without an armed escort, and the British accused the town's residents of killing a soldier. The WAF that Lugard had created 8 years earlier had been hitherto undefeated, yet they lost their unbeaten record to a group of village farmers carrying axes and hoes. This setback was dangerous because it shattered the image of British invisibility in northern Nigeria and demonstrated that the white man was also bled when cut. Religious revolts against British were rare. The fear was that if the Mahdists managed to rally the population behind a religious cause, it could set off a chain of reaction of uprisings against British rule across the region. The one man with the power to effect this outcome was the Sarkin Muslimi, who Lugard had appointed 3 years earlier, Muhammadu Atahiru II. If a native ruler whom Lugard appointed turned against him, it would also incite the policy of indirect rule. Lugard's telegram to Elgin on 24 February had revealed his apprehension about whose side Atahiru II would take. If Atahiru II chose to use religion as a means of rallying opposition to Britain, he could unite significant areas of northern Nigeria against the British administration or even cause the Hausa soldiers to mutiny against their British commanders. Burdon also expressed his fears about what would happen if Atahiru II chose to side with the Mahdists or prevaricated over the decision.
Had he shown the slightest indecision, I have no doubts but that the bulk of the Talakawa would at once have joined the army, many headmen would have fallen suit. And instead of an isolated fanatical outbreak, we should have to meet a general rising. Had he even procrastinated or confined himself to promises, the result would have been the same: the probable extermination of all Europeans in the Sokoto province.
Only 3 years after Lugard subjugated the Sokoto Caliphate, British control over the area was under threat. It is uncertain whether Atahiru II knew that the Satiru revolt had strengthened his position or how much it had unnerved Lugard. Atahiru II made his decision known by sending his horsemen to the British fort at Sokoto instead of Satiru. When they arrived, they formed a protective screen in front of it in case the Mahdists came to attack. Atahiru II also sent instruction asking the emirs to provide warriors to help protect the surviving Britons. He voluntarily conceded his position of strength. There are many plausible reasons to explain why Atahiru II and the emirs went to such lengths to support the British. Firstly, the revolt also potentially threatened the emirs. It seemed to be an insurrection against the established authorities, whether foreign or native. Although it is not certain that Atahiru II knew it at the time, the British claimed that most of the Mahdist corpses they saw at Satiru were Hausas and that many were slaves. This ethnic coloration could have pitted a dissident Hausa religious cult led by the Talakawa against the Fulani aristocracy led by Atahiru II. Secondly, Atahiru II owed his position to Lugard, who had killed his predecessor before installing him 3 years earlier. The faith of Atahiru II's predecessor was a reminder of what might happen to him if he declined to back Lugard. With the knowledge that the native leadership was backing them, the WAF started regrouping. Major Burdon acted as the de facto interim leader of both the political and military administrations. He offered a £10 reward for the return of each corpse of the white officers killed at Satiru and a £1 reward for the return of each native soldier's corpse. The fact that Burdon considered a native soldier's life to be worth a tenth of a white man's should have hammered home to the native soldiers how little their employers valued them. Burdon agreed to allow Sokoto forces under the Marafa Muhammadu Maiturari to launch a raid on the Mahdists on 17 February. Despite his initial reservations that native protecting and fighting Britain's battles would lower British prestige. However, the Mahdists repelled them and they fled in disarray. The Marafa was nearly killed. For the second time in 3 days, Privates Urikin and Zaria were again the heroes and saved the Marafa's life. However, the Mahdists had won a second successive battle in only 3 days and had humiliated both the British and Sokoto armies. Lugard and Burdon were determined to have a rematch with the Mahdists and to punish them. The desire to inflict revenge was so great that Atahiru II and other emirs sent horsemen and warriors to occupy the neighboring villages around Satiru to block the Mahdists from dispersing and to keep them at Satiru until Lugard could send reinforcements. They essentially made the Mahdists a static target. In their dispatches to the Colonial office, Burdon and Lugard repeatedly stressed their desire to reinstate Britain's damaged prestige. This desire stemmed from Lugard's conviction that an overwhelmingly disproportionate act of vengeance was required to re-establish British deterrence and discourage further religious rebellions, and that President Hillary's anxiety to avoid bloodshed was responsible for the defeat on 14th February. British officials had also been incited by exaggerated accounts by locals who claimed that the slain British officers were tortured before being killed and that their corpses were mutilated after they died. Artillery officer Major Goodwin was given command of the revenge mission. Even though he had every confidence that with my present force I shall defeat the enemy with heavy loss, he decided to wait for reinforcements because it was desirable that so dangerous a body of fanatics should be completely defeated. Troop reinforcements arrived from Zungeru, Lokoja, and Kontagora. On 10th March 1906, Goodwin marched out to subdue the Mahdists with 507 soldiers and thousands of cavalrymen provided by Atahiru II and the Emirs. Lugard admitted that the Mahdists were an almost unarmed rabble. There was little doubt about who was most likely to win a fight between a village group armed only with fighting implements and an experienced, modern-trained professional army with machine guns and mounted cavalry who had been drilled to fight in formation. Given the tremendous disparity of weaponry, what happened next can only be described as a ruthless massacre. A British historian has called it as the most bloodthirsty expedition in the history of British military operations in northern Nigeria. Goodwin wanted to entice the Mahdists en masse into the open, where they would be cannon fodder for the Maxim guns. He ordered the infantrymen to form a square in the same field where their colleagues had been killed a month earlier. Goodwin then sent out Lieutenant Fendel as bait to draw out the Mahdists. When they saw him, Fendel turned around and walked slowly back to the square without firing a shot. The Mahdists fell for the trap and emerged. Goodwin confessed that the Mahdists, to my disappointment, did not come on in the dense masses I had hoped for, but in a loose, straggling crowd. Goodwin let a group of about 100 Mahdists advance to within 150 yards of the square, then ordered the Maxim guns to open fire. After mowing down the first group, the square moved on and cut down another group of Mahdists before moving to the east side of Satiru, which had been set ablaze by shell fire. The mounted infantry moved to the west side of Satiru, while Captain Gallagher, who had been wounded by an arrow that hit his elbow, led soldiers to the south side, where they went from house to house, charging in with bayonets and killing the occupants. Goodwin was pleased with their work and later said that Gallagher and his men went at the army with a dash which I have not seen equaled in this country, with the village ablaze and soldiers conducting house-to-house mopping up operations. Some villagers fled, but Goodwin ordered his men to pursue them. The mounted infantry and the Sarki Muslimi's horsemen chased them wherever they went, in some cases 5 to 10 miles outside Satiru. The seek and destroy went on for 5 hours from early morning until mid-afternoon. They dragged out those they found from their hiding places in the bush and killed them. To deal with any survivors they could not locate, they opened fire into the bush. The killing was accompanied by extreme brutality on the part of both the WAF and the native warriors that Atahiru II and his lieutenants supplied. They impaled some of the Mahdists on the stakes and sliced off some women's breasts. When the slaughter was over, approximately 2,000 Satiru residents lay dead. The WAF and Sokoto cavalry took surviving women and children into custody and handed them to Atahiru II for subsequent disposal, a euphemism for the likely distribution of the women as concubines. They also recovered the unmutilated corpses of the 3 British officers killed and buried them with full military honors and retrieved the Maxim guns and rifles that the Mahdists had captured. Before leaving, they removed all animals from Satiru, then burned and destroyed the village. Burden reported that the day after the battle, all of Sokoto went to inspect the battlefield and to raze Satiru to the ground. No wall or tree left standing. It was a biblical scene of death and destruction. Atahiru II cursed Satiru and issued an edict forbidding anyone to rebuild the village or undertake farming there. Over 116 years later, the land where Satiru once stood is now a forest. Satiru was wiped off the map. The WAF handed over the Mahdist leader, Dan Makafo, who had been shot and wounded in the leg, for trial before an Islamic court in Sokoto. This was a deliberate measure to exact political capital from the fact that Makafo would be condemned by fellow Muslims and, in Lugard's view, to show the people how fully the native chiefs are identified with us. Makafo and some of his supporters were executed by hanging in the Sokoto marketplace. The executions became so enthusiastic that Lugard ordered a halt to further ones without his approval. On 12 March, Atahiru II and other emirs attended a massive durbar. Lugard sent a note of gratitude which was read on his behalf. Britain rewarded Atahiru II, the CMG, for his services and loyalty in suppressing the revolt. The companions of the Order of St. Michael and St. George seemed to be a strange honor to bestow a Muslim ruler. The soldiers who took part in the mission were also rewarded. Goodwin was promoted to brevet major, which is the equivalent of local lieutenant colonel. Captains Gallagher and MacDonald and Lieutenant Fendel of the Mounted Infantry were awarded the Distinguished Service Order, and Sergeants Maynard and Slack were awarded with the Meritorious Service Medal. Native soldiers Sergeant Major Aliyu Afam, Sergeant Audu, Birnin Kano, Corporal Fajenyo, and Private Nomad Bamba were awarded Distinguished Conduct Medals. Those who sent men and horses to support the British were also rewarded. Every single Sarkin Muslimi for the next 32 years after the Satiru uprising was a man who supported the British assault on Satiru. These include Muhammadu Maiturare, who succeeded Atahiru II as Sarkin Muslimi in 1915. Maiturare's son, who succeeded him, and Hassan, who handed Dan Makafo over into British custody and who became Sarkin Muslimi in 1931. Lugard carefully edited his report to the Colonial Office to underemphasize the extent of the atrocities. However, Lugard's letter to his wife, in which he freely admitted to his desire to annihilate the Mahdists and remarked that the slaughter of these poor wretches had been terrible, left no doubt as to his intent and awareness regarding what happened. Nonetheless, Lugard's successor as High Commissioner, William Wallace, investigated events at Satiru and found that killing was very free, not to say slaughter. They killed every living thing before them, and that fields were running with blood. The atrocities also came to the attention of Lugard's younger brother, Edward, who was his trusted confidant and assistant. Edward Lugard, Wallace, and other officials buried the investigation and withheld it from Parliament and the public. However, events did not escape the attention of the Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill, who did not take the pleasure from this extermination of an almost unarmed rabble, and asked, how long is this sort of thing going to escape parliamentary attentions, and what will happen when it attracts it? After eliminating Satiru, Lugard went on to settle other scores. Lugard alleged that before being executed, Makafo claimed that the Emir of Gwandu had promised to support him. As a result, Lugard ordered the Emir to be arrested and deposed. Lugard also did not forget the passive resistance of the town of Hadija. In April 1906, he delivered an ultimatum to the Emir, ordering him to arrest and hand over 8 people who were the alleged fomenters of anti-British hostility in the town, to demolish parts of the town's defensive wall, and to ensure that the town's residents surrendered all their weapons. Lugard also offered the Emir the choice of going into exile at Katagum if he was unable to comply with the demands. The Emir had 1 day to reply. Lugard must have been spoiling for a fight and knew that the Emir could not agree to such humiliating terms. Even if he wanted to agree to Lugard's terms, he could hardly do so without risking a revolt or assassination at the hands of his own people. The Emir declined to do Lugard's bidding and replied that if the British wanted to make arrests, they should do it themselves. Lugard also alleged that the Emir slapped the messenger who delivered the ultimatum. Lugard thus got what he wanted, an excuse to attack the Emir. He dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Lowry Cole, who marched into Hadija with soldiers, and after 5 hours of raids, killed the Emir and 3 of his sons. Lowry Cole's men then destroyed 150-yard section of the town's walls. Hadija was the last of the Fulani Emirates to fall into British hands. Lugard installed a new Emir and moved the Emirate headquarters to Katagum. The comprehensive root and branch destruction of the Mahdists does not diminish the significance of the rebellion in Nigeria's history. It was simultaneously a portent of further religious radicalism in northern Nigeria, a missed opportunity for the region's ruler to test the strength of British rule, and a close shave for the British. After the utter devastation at Satiru, uprisings against British rule became rare in northern Nigeria. British supremacy had been restored and greatly amplified. Notable exceptions to this were the Tiv, who were restive and menaced the British with mysterious poisoned arrows that killed those who were struck within a few hours. The British found it difficult to identify the source of the poison despite conducting toxicology tests on the arrows. But there was also another innovative but largely overlooked rebellion in the northeast area of northern Nigeria.